Now the 32X version of the game, while improved over the Genesis version, isn't quite up to par with the SNES version. A lot of people had high hopes for this port, but they were most likely disappointed. But the 32X's music was the same as the Genesis version. It did have better sound effects and sharper graphics. The opening of the game has been improved and includes the opening story with the original pictures that the arcade version had. It also includes the BIOS. The overall color palette of the game has been enhanced, and the characters are sharper. There are also more frames of animation, making the characters' movements closer to their original arcade form. But for some reason, there are still missing some. Baraka now closes his arms during his winning pose, but Johnny Cage for some reason still doesn't. Some improvements have been made to the detail of the stages, such as the chains in the Deadpool. They also managed to put back the crouching punch that wasn't available in the Genesis port. As for sound, more speech and sound effects have been implemented into the game, but the overall music is exactly the same as the Genesis version, which was a really big disappointment because the 32X was supposed to be a more powerful system. When you beat Shao Kahn at the end, it does not show Kahn yelling through all the levels as it did in the arcade and SNES versions. In general, yes, it is better than the Genesis version, but the Genesis had an excuse for being worse. It was an older system. But because it was on the 32X and was released almost a year later than the Genesis version, one would expect a lot more than the little updates that were added. It really should have been a better port. Now the Sega Saturn version of the game was released 2 years after the original ports of MK2, so one would think by now there should be an arcade accurate port. This was not the case for this version though. The graphics are indeed near arcade accurate. Just about all the animations, fatalities, babalities, friendships, and secret characters have been ported over, but the music isn't accurate. It kinda sounds like they tried to enhance the original arcade tracks, but what we're left with, in my opinion, kinda sounds crappy. I would have much rather preferred the original arcade tracks, which should have been no problem to convert to CD. Hell, even MK1 on the Sega CD had the original arcade tracks. The sound effects are for the most part accurate, but some are still missing, which definitely should not be the case since this was released on the 32-bit system. It lacks the voiceovers from Shao Kahn, such as Round 1 and the name of the player. It does have the arcade intros and BIOS, and controls were for the most part perfect. The load times seemed longer than they really should be. The fact that the game was released so early in the Sega Saturn's life could be the reason for this, but it's still disappointing. The Japanese-only PS1 version is pretty much the same as the Sega Saturn version. In fact, I would go as far as saying it's a direct port of it. The game suffers from even longer loading times than the Sega Saturn version, but the graphics and music are mostly the same. One feature the PS1 has that isn't in the Saturn port is the option to enable the announcer to say the character's names. But for some strange reason, the music never stops when you're about to do a fatality. As with most 2D fighting ports that appeared on the Saturn and PS1, the Saturn version is definitely better. Now let's check out some comparison videos of these ports.
Finish him.
Again, there are a lot more variations between the ports, but those are the major ones. As for what the best classic port is, it's really a matter of personal preference. I personally prefer the SNES version. It just seems more of a complete release. If I was to pick second best, I would definitely go with the Saturn version. Stay tuned to Retroware TV, where we will be closing our 3-part review of the 2D Mortal Kombat series with Mortal Kombat 3.